as you know, this year's Christmas series has been focusing on the Magi and the gifts specifically that they brought to Jesus. We've spent a significant amount of time over the last 2 weeks investigating the history of the Magi, who they were and where they came from and what they did. We've learned that some of the things that we always thought or had been told or even heard about these guys simply isn't true. There wasn't just 3 of them. They brought 3 gifts, but the Magi probably had a large entourage that came with them. This entourage that many scholars say could have been close to 100 people in that group included a small army of the Medo-Persian soldiers that always accompanied the Magi wherever they went. If you think about it, their arrival in Jerusalem, it unnerved Herod the king. It made him indescribably paranoid. And let's just be honest, 3 dudes on camels doesn't do that to a king. But an army of 100 on Persian steeds with soldiers in tow, that gets another king pretty nervous. So there weren't just 3 of them. We also learned they weren't kings. They were kingmakers. These Magi came from the east, and they were a part of a hereditary priesthood tribe. This tribe, the Magi, was in charge of acknowledging who would become king. And then, because they were the kingmakers, they sat as the advisors or the wise men of those kings. A third thing we learned is they weren't at the stable. Scholars say that Jesus was somewhere between 4 months and 2 years old when the wise men came to visit Jesus. In fact, you'll notice Matthew says they went in to see the young child, not the infant, the young child, Jesus. Matthew also says the Magi went into the house where Jesus was, which means Jesus was no longer at the stable. So next year, when you set up your nativity, you decorate your house. If you want to be accurate, you might want to set the wise men up a few blocks from your house, because that's about where they would have been when Jesus was at the stable. Just get your neighbor's permission, because that may look a little weird. Our area of interest this year has been focusing on the gifts that the Magi brought to Jesus. We learned that gold was for what? A king. Gold was for a king, because Jesus is our king. That's precisely what these kingmakers from the east were looking to do. Matthew 2:2 says, the Magi came to town saying, "Where is he who has been born king?" They were looking for a king. And so what we learned was that Jesus is the king, which means I am his subject. We learned second that they not only brought gold, but they also brought frankincense. And frankincense was for a priest. Or a priest. Last week we learned a lot about frankincense. Frankincense it's a resin from a specific tree that grows in Arabia. Frankincense was a significant part of the Jewish sacrificial system. When a man was actually set aside and ordained as a Jewish priest, they would mix oil and frankincense and anoint him as priest. But then also, when a Jew wanted to express his gratitude or his thankfulness to God, they would bring a meal offering or a grain offering. And that was grain that was baked into cakes. And then the Bible says that they would take oil and frankincense to put on top of the cake. And then as they burned it on the altar, the smells of frankincense would fill the temple, and it would fill the place. And that represented their thankfulness toward God. So the smells of frankincense, the thought of frankincense instantly reminded a devout Jew of the temple and the sacrifices that they offered to God through a priest. And so Jesus is our high priest. And so we said last week, since Jesus is our high priest, we should draw near to him. This brings us to our third and final gift, the one that we're going to talk about today, the gift of myrrh. Myrrh. Have you ever received a weird gift? Now, if the person's in the room that gave it to you, shake your head no. Okay, but if they're not here, you can be honest. Have you ever received a weird gift? We all have. In fact, there was a little quip in Reader's Digest that a young man remembered vividly one of the strangest gifts that his dad ever gave his mom on Christmas. He gave her a DVD for Christmas. You say, well, that's not weird. That happens all the time. It was a rental. Now let that sink in, men. We never even thought about that. That guy's a genius, isn't he? He rented a DVD and gave that rented DVD to his wife for Christmas. But the young man said, that's not even the strangest part. The strangest part is our family didn't even own a DVD player. Without a doubt, myrrh is the most curious and perhaps insulting gift that could be given to the parents of a new baby. However, I think that we will see it, as the most inspiring gift of the three, because it's going to show us the absolute depths of God's love. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1 says, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi, wise men from the east, came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his, do you remember this? His austere, his brilliance, his radiance, his bursting forth. We saw it when it rose and have come to worship him. I jump down to verse 9. It says, And after listening to the king, because you remember they go into King Herod and they ask where the baby is, and Herod puts on the mask and he says, I don't know where he is, but when you find him, come let me know so I can worship too. After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star, the radiance, the brilliance that they had seen when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. I told you a few weeks ago that the Magi didn't follow the star from the east to Jesus, and they didn't. The Magi from the east, they saw his brilliance, they saw his radiance, they saw it when it rose, and then it disappeared. So they did the most educated guess that they could do, and from the east, they traveled to Jerusalem because that made sense of where a Jewish king would be born. They arrive in Jerusalem with their entourage, asking about the arrival of the King of the Jews, and nobody knows what they're talking about. Then it says that the star, the brilliance, his radiance, it reappears, and now it leads them, but not from the east to the manger. The star actually simply leads them from Jerusalem to Nazareth, where they are. It just shows them the house. Verse 10 says, And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. When you see that in the Bible, you need to understand what that phrase means, that there was exceeding joy. They didn't just smile. This has the idea of when you ask Judson, do you want a Reese cup? Because Judson is not just going to smile and politely say yes. If you've offered him one, you know what he does. He jumps and he claps and he grins from ear to ear and he talks because he doesn't ever stop talking. That's exceeding great joy. And when the wise men, when the Magi saw his radiance, they saw his glory again. It's almost as if these dignified kingmakers are jumping and clapping. They're beside themselves with joy. Verse 11. And going into the stable? No, going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And they fell down and worshiped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. The gift of myrrh. What is myrrh? Well, myrrh, like frankincense, it was a resin from a tree or a plant. It was very aromatic. It was a reddish gum that came from the tree of a low-lying, low-growing, thorny tree. But the sap of this tree had a delightful smell, and that was myrrh. In fact, I have myrrh out in the welcome area, just like we did frankincense. So on your way out of church this morning, you can smell myrrh if you would like to. I didn't know this, but myrrh appears 19 times in the ESV, the Bible that we use. Myrrh appears 19 times, 15 times in the Old Testament, and 4 times in the New Testament. This is all going to be important, but hang with me. The Hebrew word for myrrh is more, M-O-R, more. So we say myrrh, but the Hebrews said more. But in Greek, this should ring a bell. The Greek word for myrrh is Smyrna. In case you didn't know, and if you're a Bible scholar, you probably know this, there was a city in the Bible named Smyrna. In fact, there was a church in the city of Smyrna, and at the beginning of the book of Revelation, John pens a letter from Jesus to the church at Smyrna. Smyrna is actually modern-day Izmir, Turkey. And the spice of myrrh was the chief export of this commercial city, so the town was named after Myrrh. The town in Greek was named Smyrna. So we know how they made myrrh. We even know where it comes from. But why was myrrh such a desired export? How was myrrh used? I'm going to give you 5 things. Most of them are ancient. Some of them are actually modern uses of myrrh. You ready? Number 1, women used myrrh as a beauty treatment. Women have been going to the spa for a long, long, long time. Look at Esther chapter 2, verse 12. It says, "Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments for women." Myrrh provided the ultimate spa experience for an ancient woman. It was the provided beauty treatment for all of the girls that was in the king's harem, that when he was making a decision of who would be his wife, myrrh was just a natural part of the beautifying process for women. But number 2, myrrh was also a perfume. Psalms 45 verse 8, the psalmist is talking about the king, and he says, "Your robes are all fragrant with myrrh and aloes and cassia." Proverbs chapter 7 warns a young man about a seductress. And notice what the seductress says in Proverbs 7:17. She said, "I have perfumed my bed with myrrh and aloes and cinnamon. It was also used in a normal or natural marital relationship. Solomon, the groom, says to his fiancée as she rides in toward him in Song of Solomon 3:6, "What is that coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke?" Men, I'm not going to suggest you try to use Solomon's lines. They don't work on today's women. But what is that coming up from the wilderness like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense with all the fragrant powders of a merchant? Even then, Solomon was bemoaning the fact that his woman smelled like a store. Number 3, myrrh was used as a painkiller. In fact, it is still recommended in certain parts of the world for toothaches and earaches and sprains and minor aches and pains. The Bible records it this way. Mark 15:23, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and they offered him wine mixed with myrrh. But notice this. But he did not take it. While Jesus was on the cross, dying the most excruciating death of crucifixion, the Romans offered him wine mixed with myrrh to deaden the pain. What's fascinating to me is that innocent Jesus, who doesn't deserve this crucifixion, refused it. Jesus decides to receive every single ounce of pain and refused to have the pain deadened because he was our sacrifice for our sins. Number 4, this is actually a modern use. Myrrh is used as an antiseptic. Many places in the world still use myrrh in mouthwashes and toothpaste. And they say that myrrh even prevents gum disease. But the 5th use of myrrh is why it's so important for us in our study today. You ready for this? Myrrh was used as an embalming fluid. Myrrh was used to treat the dead. The Egyptians actually used myrrh to embalm the inside of a dead body before it was entombed. The Jews used myrrh for a dead body, but they used it differently. They used it on the outside of the body. They would take funeral cloths, funeral linens, and they would soak them in myrrh, and then they would wrap the body in those heavy linens so that the smell of decay was covered up by the fragrant smell of myrrh. After Jesus dies in John chapter 19, look what it says in verse 39. Nicodemus also, who had come to Jesus by night, he came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight, to wrap the body of Jesus. It's just an interesting observation. The same substance associated with Jesus' early life, we've seen twice, is also associated with the end of his life. But what makes myrrh biblically significant? We know how everybody used it. We know where it came from. But why does it matter in our Bibles? I learned this week. I didn't know this before this week, and it has absolutely blown my mind. You ready? Ancient rabbis associated myrrh with a sacrificial death. Now remember this. The Hebrew word for myrrh is mor, M-O-R. Genesis chapter 22, verse 2. God said to Abraham, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." We know this story. God tells Abraham to take his only son Isaac and to offer him as a sacrifice. We also know the end of the story. Just as Abraham is raising the knife to sacrifice his son, God sends an angel to stop him. And the angel informs Abraham that God provided a substitute as a sacrifice because a ram was caught in the thicket. In fact, you always need to pay attention to the details in your Bible because God tells him, the Bible tells us, that the ram was caught in the thicket by its horns, which means that the body of the ram was intact. The body of the ram was without spot or blemish because it was caught by the horns. So that way it was a sinless, spotless, perfect sacrifice as a substitute for Isaac. But did you notice when we read that verse where God told Abraham to take Isaac? Go to the land of Moriah. Go to the land of Myrrh. God sends Abraham to the land, to the Mount of Myrrh, to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And from that moment on, the teachers of Israel connected sacrificial death with myrrh. In fact, Mount Moriah is the exact same area where Jesus would be crucified at Golgotha. Golgotha is about 3 football fields from Mount Moriah. So think about this. Gold for a king, frankincense for a priest, and myrrh for a sacrifice. Now imagine that you're Mary or Joseph. You hear a knock at your door and you answer it. And an army of people from the east flood into your house. Now this is a small town. Imagine this happened in Paintsville. Think about this. Imagine this. Tanks roll down the streets of Paintsville. And every so often, these foreign diplomats, they get out of the tank and they ask everybody, where is he that is born King of the Kentuckians? And everybody's like, I don't know what you're talking about. We don't have a king. And then finally they find the house that they're looking for, and this army of people go into one little house in downtown Paintsville. Would Paintsville be interested in that, or would we just ignore that? It would be the talk of the town. Nobody would talk about anything else. That would ever, can you imagine the stories? Well, I heard this, and I heard it was this, and I heard they did this. I mean, it would just run the place. And that's exactly what happened to them there. Mary and Joseph are overwhelmed in their home, and they bring all of these people, and they start unloading gifts. They bring more gold than you have ever seen in your life. And so you're embarrassed because that gift is just way too expensive and it's way too much. Then they unload the frankincense. And you know from your upbringing that this is for a priest. You're probably a little confused, but you're still thankful. But then they hand you embalming fluid. And you say, thank you. You shouldn't have, really. That's a weird gift. And it's potentially offensive. Here you have a baby, and I want to give you embalming fluid for your baby. I remember distinctly when Bryson was about 2 weeks old, my dad called one day. That wasn't unusual because they were first-time grandparents who were 13 hours away from their first grandbaby, so they called a lot. When I answered the phone, Dad's first question was, "Have you received Bryson's Social Security number yet?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, let me know when you do." I called him back a few days later, and I said, "Hey, we got his Social Security card in the mail." He said, "What's the numbers?" "Are you trying to identity theft my baby? Like, what's going on?" And he said, "I know this sounds strange, but I've done a lot of babies' funerals." And he said, "So I'm taking out an insurance policy on him so that if the worst thing happens, we don't have to worry about how to come up with the money for the expenses of the funeral at a time that we're grieving." I thought, it's pretty practical. Amanda said, "What'd your dad want?" And I said, "Not much. He's making preparations because he doesn't think we're going to be able to keep this baby alive." We did. A few bumps and bruises, but we kept him alive. The reality is most people don't think about death when they've just experienced the birth of a baby. But here Mary and Joseph are presented with a gift for Jesus of myrrh, embalming fluid. You see, we think we know the Christmas story, right? We know about the manger, we know about the shepherds, we know about the singing angels, we know about the census, we know about the wise men. But do you know the rest of the story? The rest of the story is that this child was born to die. Jesus was born to die. The cross is the entire goal of the manger. You see, unless you see the shadow of the cross falling on the crib, then you don't see the crib clearly. Because the purpose of his crib was the cross. The cross was not God's plan B. It was not a divine oops. This is the way that God planned it from the very beginning. In the 1870s, a man by the name of Holman Hunt painted this painting. It's called The Shadow of the Cross. In this painting, Jesus is at his home in Nazareth in the carpentry shop. You can see that Jesus has laid down his saw. It's on the right side of the screen. He's laid down his saw after a hard day's work, and he's stretching his arms out after having worked a long day in the shop. But as he stretches, you can see that the evening sun is casting a shadow on the wall, hanging above his hammers and hanging with his nails, a crucifix. You look to Jesus' side, he appears to be building a manger for a baby. On Jesus' right, our left, a woman, obviously Mary, is down on her knees. If you can see this, she's digging in an open treasure chest. And inside of that open lid, if you can look closely, is gold and frankincense and myrrh. You see, Hunt understood that the cross cast a long shadow throughout all of history, and the shadow is obvious in this third gift of myrrh. Because Jesus isn't just born a king, Jesus isn't just born a priest, Jesus is born a sacrifice for us. So what is our response to this sacrifice? Honestly, I think the Magi actually responded well. So let's take a cue from them. We respond first by rejoicing. The Magi found what they were looking for, and it produced joy. Here's a simple question. How much joy is a part of your life? I mean, really think about this question. How joyful are you? You know, there are people who live their life from crisis to crisis. And if there isn't a legitimate crisis, what do? They make up one. Right? One of the things you find throughout Scripture is a deep contentment and joy that comes from understanding Christ and who He is. I mean, we sing about it. This time of year specifically, right? Joy to the world. The Lord has come. Or, oh, come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. I know that this time can create a lot of grief for people. My nanny's favorite time of year was Christmas. I was thinking just yesterday that 15, 20 years ago, I know exactly where I would have been yesterday if my nanny was still alive and had her store. We would be piled in her store that Saturday night from closing time till about 1 o'clock in the morning, and we would be with rubber gloves on, packing all those bags of Christmas candy that she sold. And she'd be fussing at us, telling us we weren't doing it right. And she was right, because there was only one way, Joanne's way. There wasn't any other way. My nanny loved Christmas, and not a Christmas goes by that I don't think about the years that I spent with her and the joy that I had with her. Listen, you want to know why I am the way that I am? It's Joanne's fault. Okay, let me just explain that. I was the only grandchild on both sides for 10 years. I just thought something, and they got it for me. I didn't even have to ask. I just thought about it. I was thinking about this the other day. My nanny celebrated the 12 days of Christmas with me, which meant 12 days before Christmas, every day I got a present for 12 days, and then all the stuff on Christmas, because I was the only one. And then my sister came along and messed everything up. But I think back to Christmas, and I think about that time with my grandmother, and listen, I understand what a grieving time this can be. I do understand that. But you have got to find a way biblically to put joy on your palette of emotions for Christmas. Because what Jesus did and what those magi brought and what it means and what it represents ought to create in us joy, and joy unspeakable and full of glory. You remember back when we talked about the fruit of the Spirit. What does He produce? Joy isn't the absence of sorrow. Joy is the buoyancy of how we can float above the sorrow, because the reality of what we know and the reality of what we understand lifts us up above the turmoil and up above the trouble. But a lack of consistent, deep joy indicates that you don't understand or remember the sacrifice that Christ made. Which is why this season should be filled with joy. So how do I respond to His sacrifice? With joy. With joy. But we also respond, secondly, by worship. The Bible says that the Magi fell down. They bowed down. They were wise men, kingmakers, counselor of kings. And they fell down and they worshiped Him. I mentioned this word last week. But the Magi, they worshiped. In the Greek, it's proskuneo. It's an extremely strong Greek word, and it's reserved only for worshiping God. So why would these noble, powerful men fall down and worship this young child? Because they knew their place. You don't brag about crayon sketches when you're standing next to Picasso. And you may be a kingmaker, but you bow and you worship when you're in the presence of the King of Kings. Some commentators said that worship was actually the fourth gift that they brought. I love that idea that these wise men brought gold and frankincense and myrrh and worship. But notice this, and pay attention to this because this is what really matters. Notice who it is that they are worshiping. They are specific in their worship. They are worshiping Jesus Christ. They are not generally worshiping God. They're not claiming to just be spiritual. They're not talking to a higher power. They're not worshiping Mary. They are worshiping Jesus specifically. He's the object of our worship. But this leads us to a final aspect of their worship. I need you to understand this principle. Worship is expensive. We think of worship just as pleasant thoughts about God and lifting Him up and singing songs that we enjoy and that we worship today. And man, it was really good. Listen to me. Worship is expensive. The Bible teaches us that true worship will cost you. It will cost you financially. They worshiped and they gave gifts. That was a part of their worship. Listen, think about this. It cost a lot of money to finance a long trip for a huge entourage. The York entourage, or tribe as they were called, were only 6. And it's expensive with 6. We can't get out of McDonald's for under $50. And that's not even real food. It's expensive. And kids are always like, can we go out to eat? No. Go eat grass. It's free. But think about this. How much would it take to feed an entourage of people? Think about it, right? They had a great financial cost to come and worship. True worship will cost you financially. Gold and frankincense and myrrh, those are all expensive gifts. They didn't bring Jesus a Matchbox car. They didn't bring him a box of crayons. They didn't go to the clearance section at Walmart. They brought the most expensive gifts. Why? Because worship will cost you. It will cost you financially. It's funny to me. We don't have a bit of problem spending money at the other things that we worship. Some people around here, not me, but some people around here might dabble with golf, hunting, fishing, and we have no problem at all forking over money for clubs and poles and lures and guns. Men, don't get up and leave. You sit right where you're at. But why is it when it comes to our worship of God, it's bare minimum, if at all? true worship will cost you financially. Second thing, true worship will cost you your dignity. These were important people, and they kneeled and they bowed in their regalia. If you're going to worship, listen to me, you must be willing to give up your dignity. Some people sit or stand very stoically in church because they think that it's undignified to raise their hand or even bow down in a church service, and we justify, right? I'm not that kind of person, and I think the appropriate posture in church is a statue. The Bible's abundantly clear from cover to cover that worshiping God truly, to truly worship God, will cost you your dignity. It will cost you financially. It will cost you your dignity. Thirdly, true worship will cost you relationally. People who don't truly worship Jesus will never understand people who do. People who don't bow down and submit to Jesus as King, to Jesus as Lord, they will never understand or agree with those of us who do. Listen, I've walked the journey with people who knew that their baptism meant separation from a mom and grandparents who raised her. I've been on the 2-year journey with a young girl who made the decision to follow Jesus, knowing that her family would sever their relationship with her. Because true worship will cost you. It will cost you financially. It will cost you your dignity. It will cost you relationships. Because worship is expensive. We've looked long and hard at these gifts of the Magi, what they brought, what they meant. We've seen that we today bring gold for our King. We bring frankincense for our priest. Today we bring myrrh for our sacrifice. The amazing thing about the sacrifice of Jesus is that unlike any other sacrifice that has ever been given, he was sacrificed and then 3 days later rose to newness of life. Think about this. Magi from the east give this Christ child myrrh as a young child. 32, 33 years later, that child fulfills his goal, his purpose, his destiny, and is sacrificed for us and is laid in a tomb, wrapped in 75 pounds. No. Now listen, Jesus wasn't asleep. Jesus wasn't in a coma. Jesus died completely, fully died. And 3 days later was resurrected by his own power. And his life came back into him. Jesus smelled myrrh because that was what he was wrapped in, which was prepared for him by Magi who came, because myrrh is for a sacrifice.